from the News Channel 5 network. This is OpenLine.
Good Monday evening to everyone watching. This is OpenLine. We're so happy that you're starting your week here with us. Tonight, we're joined by our wonderful guest, Dr. Thomas Schwartz, Professor of International Policy, Vanderbilt University, longtime guest. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me on the program.
We appreciate it. Well, we've got a lot to talk about tonight. We were just talking earlier about where do we even begin? We're going to speak about the situation in Ukraine, the protests in Iran, but I figured we'd start domestically here and just take a look at inflation and how it's being affected by the situations happening overseas. So let's just start there and kind of give me a snapshot of where we are here in the U.S.
Well, our economy is integrated into the global economy, and so we're affected by disruptions in supply chains. We're affected by disruptions in production of agricultural goods, such as in the Ukraine, having an effect also on our farm products here. We're also affected by the choices of the OPEC and oil countries to raise the price of oil and to send up gasoline as well in this particular context. So the United States is facing both inflation caused by our own spending and production of money supplied during the pandemic, but also by all the disruptions that are going on in the world today.
Yeah, and then before we continue this conversation, just a reminder, we want to hear from you. So go ahead, break the ice, be the first one to give us a call. We'd love to hear your comments, any questions for Dr. Schwartz. But going off of what you just mentioned, you know, there's so many factors outside of our own nation that's affecting inflation here domestically. With that being said, I think a lot of people are wondering, when are we going to get a break? You know, and with so many external factors involved in the situation, is there an answer?
Well, I mean, what might happen, of course, is we get a recession. And a recession would drive down demand and would at least have an effect on the inflation rate. That's not a great answer, but it is one of the things that the Fed is trying to do now by tightening money supply may in fact lead to a recession here. And there are indicators in the economy that we might be heading toward a recession, and that will lead to an increase in unemployment, an increase in or a decrease in or the increase in unemployment, and then effectively a decrease in demand, which will then lower inflation for various products.
What are some of those indicators?
Well, in particular, of course, the production levels in the last couple of quarters have been down. That the gross national product has not increased. We had an interesting effect. We had 2 quarters when they were down, and then a quarter when it seemed to go up again, so that the technical definition of a recession was met, and then it seemed to bounce back in the last quarter. We'll just have to keep watching to see whether the Fed's tightening of the money supply and Fed's tightening of the credit is going to have this effect overall.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people are talking about possibly another rate hike in December.
Yes.
Is that something you foresee happening?
I do. I think the real question there is whether they'll whether they'll continue at the rate they are or lower it a bit more because they feel like they're now having an effect.
Right, because the latest one was 3/4 of a percentage point. What do you foresee, you know, assuming that we are seeing some type of hike, what could it be in December?
I think it might be less, might be a 1/2 point rather than the 3/4 point.
Okay.
So.
And I didn't want to throw around the R word, but since you said it, you know, a lot of people are talking about a recession. At what point, you know, do we say, okay, we are officially in a recession?
Well, there was a technical definition of a decline in the gross national product in 2 quarters. We had that, but then the argument was that with such a tight labor supply and with so many other factors I think in particular the fact that the unemployment rate had not increased, there was a feeling that, well, this is unusual. This is a pandemic-related downturn, and the fact that it did reverse the next quarter has led people to wondering whether we're going to have the type of recession we've had in the past, where you had real declines in production overall. And we'll have to just see. That is something I think that we'll have to see in the first couple of quarters of this next year.
Yeah, and you made a great point. You know, that was something I want to ask about. When people think of recession, they automatically think of about the 2008, 2009 era.
Absolutely.
But that's not necessarily the type of recession we could see, right? Talk to me about that.
That was a much more severe downturn. We've had more mild recessions in the post-war period where you had a brief decline and then a resumption of growth. The Great Recession, as it's called sometimes by people, of 2008, 2009, was very, very serious and did lead to double-digit unemployment for an extended period of time. We don't necessarily have to see that coming to see some type of slowdown that would be a recession. And in fact, a number of countries in Europe, according to that indicator, are also in recession now. So we may be also brought down by other countries as well as they turn into recession.
And that was actually something I was about to ask you about. You know, we're feeling the pain here in the U.S., but are other countries in a recession of their own right now?
Well, Great Britain seems to be, and it has even a worse inflation rate than we do. It will be interesting to see how continental Europe does this winter, because they have shortages of energy created by the Russian embargo, or the restrictions on Russian oil and gas. So there's going to be, I think, real concerns there. China is a different issue too, in that China at least has been saying they're growing, but it's clear that they've had economic disruptions from their zero COVID policy and some of the other things they've adopted. So we're in a global economy, and we are affected by downturns in other countries.
Yeah, and you mentioned Russia, and of course that is a country that not just the U.S. but other members of NATO have put sanctions on. You know, do you foresee a point where other nations will have to sort of ease up on those sanctions because of the repercussions it's having on their own economy? Well,
that is the gamble that Vladimir Putin is actually hoping for this winter, that European countries will begin to find that it's just too hard to cut off Russian gas and oil, and then the cold. Their citizens will demand that they start trading and that they resume some degree of exchange. Right now, no, though. I mean, Russia right now is still faced with a fairly united front against it because of its aggression in Ukraine. Its behavior recently of starting to strike at Ukrainian electricity and utilities has made it even more of a pariah. So I don't think for the time being any country in Europe is going to be willing to be the first to break. We'll have to wait and see. I think if we got a particularly severe winter and cold, then I think you might see some pressures growing on the countries, on some of the countries in Europe to ease up.
So it'll be interesting to see how the next few months develop overseas.
Sure.
Right. Well, just a reminder, there's the number at the bottom of your screen. We want to hear from you. Go ahead and call in. But, you know, I do want to ask, in terms of Russia and Putin, are the sanctions having any effect on him and on the country? Are they working?
The sanctions are having an effect. It's a slow process. It has restricted Russian output. It has had an impact overall on the Russian economy and its relative decline, but not as severe and not as immediate as I think some might have hoped. And certainly Russia, I think, is likely to be able to sustain or to continue its war if there's not other factors coming into play. And here's where it gets complicated is, of course, the Ukrainians' recent successes on the battlefield have struck a real blow at the propaganda and the image of Russian forces. And I think that's likely to have more of an effect on Putin and the Russian army and the Russian people than the sanctions themselves. They've been used to sanctions. They got sanctions in 2014 as a result of the initial Crimean invasion. So the sanctions are not the central thing that will have an impact. I think it's more the events on the battlefield.
So since we're talking about Russia, go ahead and give us a snapshot of the situation with the war with Ukraine right now.
Okay, the Russians have experienced real setbacks. They had conquered a number of provinces in the eastern part of the country, and they had actually even absorbed them into Russia. They staged referendums which were by international observers' comments were completely fraudulent, but they staged referendums. People voted to become part of Russia. Well, That led to a situation where Putin was threatening the use of nuclear weapons to defend them, saying that they're Russian territory. But in fact, when the Ukrainian army was successful in taking back Kherson, which was one of those capitals, the Russians simply retreated. And they have faced real challenges in holding on to the territory that they have gained. And there's a real issue now of whether they'll be cut off from their contact with Crimea, which is in the southern part, by a Ukrainian offensive there. Now, the winter is settling in, and that may slow down any sort of combat on the part of the Ukrainians. It's also the case that Russia is using a type of remote warfare, sending missiles from Russia into Ukraine to strike at the electric utilities, to strike at infrastructure there, as a way of weakening Ukrainian resolve to continue the war. So far that hasn't worked, but on the other hand, we haven't really hit the severity of winter yet.
Yeah. And then I know that we've heard discussions about Russia forming allies and seeing support from other nations. Is that support for Russia from its allies still there, or is it dwindling?
It's hard to say. For the most part, it doesn't appear that there's any pressure coming from, say, from China or from India or other countries that have tried to stay neutral in the conflict. The countries supporting Russia, the most important probably are the ones right next to it, like Belarus, which has not yet sent forces there, although they've allowed some attacks to come from their soil onto the Ukraine. But for the most part, Russia is really devoid of allies on this war. It really has. It has countries that I was recently in Vietnam, where that country has an official position of neutrality toward the war, but the people's sentiments are very pro-Ukrainian. The country is being neutral because it buys its weapons from Russia, and that's the same situation as with India as well, that Russia has been a weapons supplier, so they don't want to alienate Putin, but they're not, the support level is very minimal for this war, and I think Putin is probably hearing from some of them that they'd like to see him come to some sort of negotiated settlement.
I know we can keep going, but we have to squeeze in a quick commercial break. We'll be back with Dr. Thomas Schwartz after this.